We all want our children to be healthy. That's why we teach them about nutritious foods and encourage them to exercise. It's why we don't allow them to survive on ice cream and candy alone. But what about their mental, emotional, and social health? How do we teach them healthy habits in a modern world full of technology?
When it comes to screen time, there's healthier, more nutritious screen time, and then there's just the equivalent of junk food. And I honestly think that these violent video games are absolute junk food. And helping parents understand, it's not just that, okay, they did their homework and now they can play hours of video games and violent video games, which again, the shooters, where someone who dies just kind of disappears. It's not even realistic. But it's not a 50-50 thing. This should be really limited in the diet, and these video games don't do anything to help people feel connected. I don't care if you have a best friend who's playing the game with you across the country or across the country or another country. It's still quite isolating and empty social calories, if you ask me.
In today's balanced conversation with Dr. John Stevens, who's the Chief of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the Chief of Outpatient Services at the Menninger Clinic, we discuss everything from when to get your child a cell phone and what you should consider before doing so, to how young people are being affected mentally by our modern world. Ultimately, we answer this question: how do we help our youth develop a healthy relationship with technology? Let's jump in. Without further ado, here's your host, Renia Mankarios.
Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. We are thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Stevens of the Menninger Clinic. Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Rania. Nice to speak with you again.
Yeah, we've done a few interviews together over the years. And when we launched this podcast, we say it's for the community, by the community. I went into parent groups and I said, look, what do you guys want to hear about? And today's session literally is pulled together from all the different questions I'll say parents, primarily moms, sent to us. So you're like going to be our one-stop shop for so many different things. And we really do thank you for spending the morning with us. All right, we're going to jump right in. Gadgets. A lot of parents said, look, I know there's sort of rules of engagement for gadgets, but let's just be honest. All of our kids have them. As parents, we hand our kids these iPads, we hand them smartphones. Sometimes it's just a function of getting through the day, especially during COVID. What is a real age? Like, give us some guidelines on when kids really should or should not be getting these first gadgets.
Well, I'll be a classic psychiatrist and hedge and say it depends. Because the reality is, especially with distance learning, and increasingly better educational apps that are available, even toddlers are on some kind of gadgets. But when you talk about issues like having your own cell phone, I generally advise putting it off as long as possible. Middle school would be great, but I think you and I know considerably younger kids that have access. I think starting a conversation with your child as young as possible about the pros and cons and putting limitations is the most helpful initial approach. Clearly, technology has been one of the unsung heroes in many ways of the pandemic. And I've written about that and we've published about that in terms of really keeping people connected during a very difficult time, whether you're talking about helping younger people stay in touch with family members that are far away, perhaps even elderly family members. There are undeniable pros about technology. I mean, look at us today meeting on this. Otherwise, we might not be able to have this and using this technology today. But there is a downside, and you've been really outspoken about risks of cyberbullying, excessive use of gambling or these video games that require that credit cards from parents, or even pornography. And there are some not so nice people that also are accessing our children if there are not really safeguards. So we have to also start educating our children in age-appropriate ways about the downside risks as young as possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we speak to like 5th grade classes, 6th grade classes, and 4th grade classes, and parents will say, my kids are involved in after school activities, or my daughter or son rides their bike home. And I know that we're not supposed to give them a cell phone or any form, but yet we want to be able to reach them. And I've always said, look, it's not necessarily the cell phone itself that is a problem. Mm-hmm. It is what they're able to access on it. So, if you can get them a flip phone, if you can get them like a little gizmo watch or some type of platform or gadget that they can connect with you, that's great. It's what they can do on a smartphone in terms of access to the internet, access to apps, that becomes dangerous, gaming, etc. So if that can be limited, then I think it's safe to give your child a cell phone at a younger age. But would you disagree even with that? I mean, if you've really limited their access to the outside world, do you still disagree with giving them a gadget at a young age, or specifically a cell phone at a young age?
Well, the cell phone, as you said, is a slippery slope for some kids. And I've seen some kids get into trouble with that. Whether it's taking pictures, sending pictures. It actually, for a time there, was one of the leading risk factors of a child getting hospitalized at the Menninger clinic. There was some cyberbullying, and then a child feels suicidal or had a picture that got out, that leaked out in a school, and really within minutes, their reputation was ruined. So I think I like what you had to say. I might put a few other rules on top of that in terms of perhaps keeping the tech out of the bedroom, let's say at home. I think a lot of parents are only aware of the tip of the iceberg into their child's total screen time use. So it's not just the cell phone, it's computer, it's the iPad, it's the TV. And I think when people start looking at that, there was one CNN story that said that our young people are consuming up to 9 hours of screen time a day. And that was a few years ago. That's pre-COVID.
9 hours a day. I mean, that's unbelievable. I always think of some of these studies, some that came out of Europe and others here, that talk about how children are defining themselves through social media. Right. Little girls used to say, in my day, you might get dressed up because you want to look cute for your friends, or you might have a crush or whatever. Yeah. Now it's like we get dressed up, we put on makeup, put on our clothes, set the scene literally to take a selfie and engage with the world that way online. And that's damaging to some regard. So I want to move into social media because a lot of our kids are on social media at a young age. And I can spit out some of the red flags in terms of like access to strangers, solicitation, the dangers with tracking devices. A lot of these apps will literally tell anyone you're connected to. And these kids don't understand that just because they have a mutual friend, it doesn't mean that they know this person. So they connect with a lot of people they don't know. And you have an app like Snapchat that has a snap map that literally shows where you are in real time. That creates a danger. I mean, very significant dangers. But there's a whole other layer behind social media in terms of, where you find your value and how you're going to define yourself. And we've seen statistics with self-harm and suicide. Can you talk to us about all of that? I mean, that's one of the biggest questions that came in for you. How do we know if our child should or should not be on social media? At what age? And then we're going to move from that into, well, how do you have age-appropriate conversations with them without scaring them to death or giving them anxiety?
It's not about scaring them to death, but it's about really, if they're going to be doing on these sites, like you mentioned a couple of sites, that if you really look on their privacy, you're not supposed to be on that site or have an account unless you're 13 or over. And even that, I see some 13-year-olds that are wholly inequipped to deal with the social pressures that are out there. So I think 13 is there for a reason. But I think you and I know children out there that I've seen in my office that you've talked to parents that have accounts, or the parents help them get an account at a considerably younger age. And I think that's a very dangerous kind of practice, because again, I see day after day in my office that parents don't know a lot about their child's. It's really part of their social life when you think about it. You kind of said it better, Rania. This is their social life. And in the past, while our parents knew our friends, perhaps in the neighborhood or from school, I don't think it's easy for parents, unless they're intentional about it, to know who their children are dealing with in these social media formats, and any of them. I'm not really trying to pick out any of them, but that's part of the danger. And it's easy to become something you're not on these social media platforms. So that's, is this really someone who's at your child's school, or is it an adult masquerading as this? And I've had to learn a whole new set of terminology in my office over the last several years, ranging from ghosting to catfishing to all these other terms that I didn't know. Because this, I don't think this was part of our childhood, but yet it is now. So I think when the conversation starts, I think when you start with the little kids, you really need to supervise their access to these sites. And that's why I say, when in doubt, keep the tech out of the bedroom. If the computer's out in a main area of the house or the iPad's out, you can look over their shoulder, ask a question, see what's going on. Sit with them. If it's the video games, and we're talking a lot, especially the boys, not only the boys, but a lot of times that social back and forth is through these video games that are interactive. But with the headphones on, the headsets, you don't know who they're talking to. In many cases, it might be someone you don't want them to talk to, or in many cases, the language or the content are things that you don't want them to talk to. When it turns to the tweens, you really want to have an open conversation of what they are seeing on the internet. There's things there that are not age appropriate, and they might not understand it. So putting yourself not as the cop necessarily or the warden in this kind of situation, but as someone you could come to for advice. The child, if they're seeing something that they don't know what it means, obviously I'm thinking about some of the sites, again, with pornography, recognizing that a lot of that is not love. It's sex, and it's a version of that, but it's not love. And helping them, if they trip onto that, or certainly in the teenagers, if they're seeking that out, to help them understand what it is. And the teens, again, you can have more of a real conversation. If you're not talking about it on their terms of what they're seeing, or their boyfriend that's at a distance, if you're not asking and talking to them in a real way, they're going to assume that you're uncomfortable with that. So sometimes starting a conversation, then coming back to it later, and finding a time when you can access your teenager. Teenagers are very hard to talk to, and I see that every day in the office. But really having a space and knowing when you could reach that teen. It's likely when they don't have the cell phone in their hand or something, or you're going to have to reach them. Is it on the drive to school? Is it is it at the dinner table, or is it a completely different time when you have their full attention to have a real conversation about what's going on in their online world and their online identity?
This balanced conversation is made possible by Brigitte and Bashar Kalai, Hallie Vanderheider, Sippy and AJ Karana, and Deepwater Productions. If you're interested in furthering our mission of facilitating balanced conversations, offering real solutions, contact us at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com.
It's really interesting when you think of social media and how it affects our kids. And yet we do say it is how they socialize. It's literally how they socialize. And I like how you say their brains are not yet equipped to handle what's really pouring in through social media channels. And one of the ways when we talk to kids, I just spoke to a group of, not too long ago, to a group of female seventh graders, and, talking to the parents as well. And it's like, would you send your child into a room where the room is literally divided in parts, where one part is not just pornography, but highly inappropriate pornography.
Right.
It's not just a love scene from the Titanic. It is content created by social media, by pornographic platforms that have pushed the envelope, because they need to always be doing more than they did the week ago or a month ago or a year ago. And statistics show, and you might have different numbers, but 90% of boys have said they've interfaced with that type of pornography. 63% of girls have said that they've interfaced with that type of pornography. So that's one part of the room. The other part of the room is where your child's constantly saying, do you like me? Do you like me? Do you approve of me? Do you approve of me? And parents will say, what are you talking about? And I said, well, think of how you engage on social media. It's all about likes and comments and shares. And if you're posting something and nobody's responded, these kids feel broken. It becomes immediately, should I delete it? Why don't they like me? What am I not doing right? What do I need to do differently? Oh, wait, they did like that. How can I keep that going? And then, and then for me, you will disagree with this, Dr. Stevens, because we've talked about it. The third quadrant seems to be very violent. And I know you've said studies show that the violence doesn't really affect these kids, specifically in gaming. But for me, it seems like it's just negativity pouring into these kids. And then the fourth is a lot of questions. How do I reach you? What will you give me? Online solicitation of minors is skyrocketing, 93. So when I break it up that way, parents will say, well, I'd never send my kid into a room like that, especially 9 hours a day. But yet that's where our kids are. And it's but it's also where they live, and it's hard to pull them out of that. So what do we do? How do you have conversations around these topics without scaring them, but also knowing this is a reality of what they're going to face? Also knowing that, look, I'm not a tech savvy person. I don't even know how to really block this. I can talk about blocking it all day long. I really don't know how to block it. So what do we do?
Well, you brought up so many different issues, and I'd love to talk about all of them. But I think starting earlier is better. When you're already trying to change put a lock on the phone or doing that, you're kind of you're behind in that game. You're losing badly.
Yeah.
So
Good point.
Because once you're doing that with a teenager, it really speaks to a lack of control, that parents have to try these heroic efforts. And it oftentimes to the teenager seems reactive, like you never cared before X, and now you're coming down really hard and it seems punitive. So again, for those parents, just to be more mindful, especially now with all of the different stressors in society that parents face. I am not coming down hard on parents, but the reality is when you're talking about the actual medical dangers of COVID, the financial for those that have lost jobs or lost hours or are more insecure, maybe now working from home. And if you're working from home, in many cases, that means working more hours or really blurring the boundary, that children have had more time to themselves, left to their own devices, literally and figuratively. And they're spending more time. Now, again, some of that is their school and staying connected, but a lot of it has unfortunately just become bad habits. So if there are habits that you've seen, starting again, maybe at night, that child at any age has to, if they're having a cell phone, check it in like an old library book to use something so that they don't have it at night. It's not good for their sleep. The light's not good for their sleep. And those texts throughout the night or the instant message, all that stuff is not great for disturbance. But at your dinner table, are you checking your phone? And I'm not saying you, Rania, but
I am. And I know it's so wrong.
So there's an easy opportunity, changing your own habits. So making it that everyone's involved, everyone has skin in the game, so to speak, that it's not just that tween or that teenager's problem, that we're all going to make this a cell phone free time. It's hard. I do it too. I get calls from the office, from the hospital. I got to answer, but it sends a message though that it's permissive. And if you can do it, if mom or dad can do it, then why can't I? Another thing, you talked about the pornography. I see this as increasing an issue. And I didn't talk about these things earlier in my career but I do now, because for a lot of young men and women, that this has become, a place that this loneliness, this feeling of dislocation, this feeling of isolation, which all of us know. For those teenagers, they think that that's maybe a way that's, again, confusing love and sex. And I agree with you. But I've had parents that say, fathers in an office say, well, I had a Playboy when I was his age. And I think what you're shaking your head, and it's not the same thing anymore.
It's not the same.
And that the parents, it kind of speaks to of detachment from what the child is truly accessing or the teenager is truly accessing.
It's interesting. We had a group of, again, young high school kids that were talking about pornography and bullying, cyberbullying. And they said, we don't know a boy today that isn't not just watching pornography, but like it's a part of his lifestyle. It's something that he's going to interface with every single day on dates. He's going to bring it up. If he's intimate with a girl, she's going to tell, these are young girls saying, you can tell that the interaction is not just normal baseline, a boy and a girl having a kiss. It's much different. Their entire world and their view of this type of relationship has changed. And the pornography that we know exists is very, very aggressive and very, very, it can be very extreme and very easy to access. The other thing we mentioned was cyberbullying. And a lot of these girls will say, it's all the time. And it's like, well, that's stalking. That can be cyber stalking. But they just shrug it off and they say, it is what it is. It just is a part of life. But you and I know that kids are committing suicide in record numbers. There's self-harm in record numbers. How do we marry these and help young kids understand the consequences of what they're doing?
Well, this is where parents stepping in. And I think you right now, what you're doing, raising awareness about this is important and really sounding the alarm, because as we're facing all these different societal pressures, elections, increase in racial tensions, even on social media, on some of these apps, find in your neighborhood that there are issues going on that I wasn't even aware of in terms of crime and break-ins and car. And it feels like we're really at all sides getting hit with these stress and traumas. And then imagine what it's like for our youth. So to take a breath, take an inventory, maybe just start to figure out how much screen time your child is consuming. How much is your family consuming? And are there easy ways to start limiting that? Not in a punitive way, but starting a discussion. And then maybe going for the things that again, if it's pornography, if it's, there's a lot of stuff with gambling and spending a lot of money sometimes on video games. I've seen that. I met with a young person the other day in his 20s who spent over $200,000 buying trinkets, not real items, for a character in a video game, and how reinforcing that is. And people get into deep financial trouble, or just that's the reality now. That's the reality now, because these games are so realistic that it's kind of really more interesting than our current reality, which is, as you know, really tough. And if you see, when you look as Santa's little elves are out there trying to pick up the latest toys, what are the runs on? You can't find a PlayStation 5. You can't find an Xbox Series X right now. And that's just not teenagers anymore. That's, our brothers, our husbands, our uncles, that's adults too. So there are a lot of things to bring up that adults have to model. And again, if they can model it correctly, then you could be a role model, which most of us as parents want to be. You want to be something that your children look up to, but we're going to have to perhaps change some of our own behaviors as well. It's not just going to be what we do to the child, it's what we're doing with them.
So how would you tell us to talk to kids about these really tough issues, like when we know that our children are going to interface or interact with somebody they don't know? We know that human trafficking, people say social media is the new track. We know that online solicitation of minors is up by 93%. We know that in order to be seen on TikTok or to go viral in any way, especially if you're a girl, there's got to be something sexual. There's got to be something suggestive. You've got to be showing skin. How do we talk to kids without scaring them about these dangers? And I will add to that, when we're back in sort of a regular world, and kids are back at school, and we talk about violence on campus. We've always battled this. Like, we want our kids to understand what to do if there's an active shooter, but we don't want our kids to know that active shooters even exist or could happen there. So maybe we don't talk about it, but God forbid it happens. We want them to be trained and immediately know what to do. How do you balance these difficult conversations without giving your child anxiety or unrealistic fears?
Well, you'd be surprised, how resilient children and young people are. And I see their resilience every day. But I also sometimes, as a psychiatrist, see this, that I have to talk about difficult issues. I have to ask about suicidality, suicidal thoughts, sometimes even homicidal thoughts in the office. And sometimes that's very jarring to a parent. I have to ask about drug use. I have to ask about sexual activity, not because it's something I want to, but it's part of their mental well-being. And if I feel that it's too uncomfortable or awkward for me to talk about, then what is that saying to the child? So I would hope, I didn't answer all your questions, but this is a new world that we are going to have to talk about other issues. Like I said, some of the terminology I've had to learn to talk to kids in their own language about, so tell me more about this boyfriend. So how did you meet him? How old is he? How do you know? Oh, you're going to meet up? Do your parents know about meeting up? You'd be, so I, as a physician, have to take that. But I think it's really helpful when I have a parental partner, just one, sometimes of two, because you can't get out on two that are also taking that same approach of keeping an open door. That's kind of metaphorically being curious, not judgmental. So kind of leading the judgment at the front door, but keeping that curiosity. And then when it's appropriate, if there's really a red line that you as a parent feel that child is crossing, then to just express that. And sometimes have to put limitations, and recognizing, especially the teenagers are going to be upset when you do that. You're not going to be, number one mom, number one dad that day. But if you're truly sticking to your values, the child will not just listen to the explicit words, but the implicit body language that you've been involved, you've been curious for those weeks and months and years leading up to it. And right now, this is something that you're really concerned about. If you put it off, if you delay, and then it's, the train has left the station, and then you're trying to come in, then you're going to seem like the heavy, the warden, so to speak. And that's a role that's difficult for parents and usually not that successful.
Do you advise, and I like what you're saying, I think it's important to have these conversations and do them in a calm manner, don't infuse panic, don't infuse fear, just talk about what could go on. And I always, with my own girls, I talk about the airplane, and I'll never forget, I'm originally from Boston. We fly back and forth to Houston, Boston all the time. And my kids, when they really start to understand sort of the airplane safety at the beginning, I remember my daughter saying, wait, is this plane not safe? Like the first time she really understood what we were talking about. And in case of an emergency landing, if there's a water landing, if the oxygen, and I said, no, it's actually so safe because they've thought about everything and they're just making sure we think about everything. And it's been really important for me to make public safety not a scary, I'm scared, I'm paranoid, I can't function in the world. Public safety is not about that. These are, I'm powerful, I'm strong, I can observe, I can see what can happen, and I can be above it. And that's how we raise our girls, and we want to bring the conversation to other people. And so, yes, a school shooting could happen, but it's not likely to happen in a school like this because we're all prepared. We're all taking steps. We're all noticing changes in our neighbor and our friends. We're noticing when kids are not just suicidal, but homicidal. We're not ignoring or isolating those who are showing red flags. We're embracing them. We know what to report. We know what to alert. We are going to make sure that nothing happens in our school. Let me ask you a question though. As a parent that is having these open conversations with children, do you want to highlight stories that happen in other places? Like, oh, okay, I know you're on Snapchat, or I know you're on Instagram, or I know you're wherever. Hey, little Lindsay, there's a story out of Kansas of a 12-year-old girl that went missing. Or do you stay away from stuff like that if you feel like your child understands the dangers?
Well, I think you can use those stories. It's usually better if it's personal. Even though they'll roll their eyes at mom's story, but really when you were talking about the plane, when you really listen, if you do listen anymore, when you're about to, take off, it could kind of sound scary.
Yeah.
And so kids can take that as long as they know. My parents tell stories about taking precautions in classrooms for a nuclear event, basically for nuclear annihilation. And our parents had to deal with that. Ours, we had to grow up, seeing Columbine on the television, seeing the Challenger, seeing other, and it doesn't mean that you didn't go to school. I think there's a small subset, a very small subset that is upset and will develop separation anxiety or panic or things like that. And that's when you have to refer them to a school counselor, a pediatrician, or a child psychiatrist like myself. But I think for the large majority, you want to empower them with that knowledge, not just scare them. And I think it's all about the delivery, Rania. It's really like if you're saying, hey, I'm just reading this. Did you hear about this story? And you share it in a truly collaborative way, not for shock value, but really like this caught my eye. I think that could be a teaching tool. And to also, again, like I said, stay curious. I'll tell you a quick story of mine. A few years ago, I was dealing with a physician's daughter and who had ADHD, and I prescribed her stimulant. And we spent so much time with the risks and benefits. I didn't get to talk to her about some of the safety with her medicine to the second visit. And the parents were both there. And I'm saying, just in case, just so you know, I'm prescribing this medicine for you. And, this is not for you to give to your friends or share or any of that. And she said, well, Dr. Stevens, actually, since the last visit, I've already a couple boys at school asked me to give them my Adderall. And the father physician was, what? What do you mean? And then she leans over, she's like, Dad, they've asked me for way worse than that.
It's like, so, what?
Yes. And you can imagine my face is still getting red all these years later. But basically, we opened the conversation, and you'd be surprised for that teenage girl. She already knew her boundaries and her values. And I had that conversation. I was just reinforcing it. But for the parents, clearly, this was a conversation that they hadn't had before. Maybe there's some other conversations they hadn't had before, but it opened the door. And these young people are really the adults of the future. They're going to have to, again, be in this role, pretty soon as parents themselves. It goes by so quickly. So try to empowering them in an age-appropriate way. It doesn't take away necessarily their innocence, especially in the teenagers. They're being bombarded by the images, like you just said, and the stories, but to give them that time to process it. Because a lot of times they'll say that they understand it, like intellectually, they can hear the stories, but emotionally, they're much slower to process it. And what does it mean? What does it feel like to be that person who is cyberbullied? A lot of times when you try to have them show that empathy for the person, you really see the immaturity shows itself, even though they can tell you all the details of the story in school and why, there are all these chats. They could say that kind of rote, but then emotionally, they have a hard time really understanding the emotional impact that these stories have.
Crime Stoppers of Houston is dedicated to cyber safety education. The Safe School Institute and Safe Community Program have partnered together to create a series of resources to aid you in keeping your family safe online. Visit crime-stoppers.org/cyber-safety to utilize these resources and view our YouTube series on social media safety.
You mentioned a few times that there are all these terms that you've had to learn this year or in recent years dealing with youth. Can you share some of them, like the top terms or issues that you're seeing present in your office?
Oh, now you're showing me up, right? Because I'm terrible at that, and I have to do my Urban Dictionary. But there are so many different slang terms out there. If I say it's going to be, I mentioned a couple earlier that I really didn't know the term catfishing until there was a young girl that thought, she was in a relationship with a same age boy, and it wasn't. It was actually a girl in her classroom who was cyberbullying her in this way, and it was. It really led to, we haven't talked about some of the psychiatric symptoms, which in this case were depression, anxiety, and eventually suicidal thoughts, because the relationship meant so much. Youth, like adults, we're all reaching out. I mean, I have colleagues that had a divorce or haven't found love yet. They're going, maybe not in COVID, on the dates, just like they're trying to reach out too. And it's not any different in youth, except for them, it's oftentimes the first few times. So they invest so much of their personal identity in these relationships, whether in that case, that wasn't even a real person, the person that she thought, and having to learn. But how I make up for it, my own naivete, Rania, how I make up for it is staying curious, letting the youth teach me. And they actually love doing that, because when they're saying, they roll their eyes, Dr. Stevens, this is that. And then I kind of play, this is a date myself, like the old Columbo. I'll just kind of ask questions like, well, how does that work? Or how did you get around your parental control? And that, you just reset the phone. That's really easy. You don't know how to reset it? Or how did you get around this? And then it just creates a space where, again, I'm safe, hopefully increasingly safe. And I do try to keep the youth's confidentiality there, but oftentimes then I could let the parent know, like, I think you need to look a little bit more into your child's social media usage. That's not breaking confidentiality. That's not of the session, but I kind of clue them in. And usually the parents are they're more in the dark than I thought I was.
We have a list at Crime Stoppers of some of these terms that we will share in show notes for this podcast. But I think these are such important conversations. I want to touch on one more before we run out of time with you. And I already know that we're going to have you back. So Anytime. There's no question there. You have stood by and cited studies that talk about, the nexus between violence and gaming, and that doesn't seem to exhibit itself in the way youth interact. And I've always disagreed with you, although I'm not doing research on it. But that's still the professional position, that all of this violence and the aggression mixed with the noise and the words and the amount of time kids are on these games shooting each other and whatever, that it doesn't have an impact on their development or behavior?
Well, I think it absolutely can have a desensitizing impact. And I think that being evidence-based and looking at the research, I don't see a clear link between the playing those games and violent behaviors. Now, if there are other studies, if your audience could find those, and that, I'm happy to reevaluate that. But I think your position and mine is actually closer to the fact. And the way I explain it to families is about really the child's kind of social media or video game intake. And that there's, when it comes to screen time, there's healthier, more nutritious screen time. And then there's just the equivalent of junk food. And I honestly think that these violent video games are absolute junk food. And helping parents understand, it's not just that, okay, they did their homework and now they could play hours of of video games and violent video games, which again, the shooters, where someone who dies just kind of disappears. It's not even realistic. But it's not a 50-50 thing. This should be really limited in the diet. I realize that it's out there. Some kids, tends to be boys in my practice, but in your experience, it might be different, tend to bond around this. It's something they can kind of relax, a distraction. Very oftentimes, these boys don't even actually shoot real guns. In my experience, at least around here in Houston, they've never shot a real gun in their life, but they're an expert in call of whatever, So I think it's important to be aware of it. But again, just to your audience, when you really look at violence, we've lived in a violent society, and America has been a violent society for a very long period of time. The homicide rate over the last couple of decades actually been decreasing. But if you really look at the suicide rate, especially in that 15 to 19-year-old age group, it's been increasing. And I think that's where depression and suicidality, and these video games don't do anything to help people feel connected. I don't care if you have a best friend who's playing a game with you across the country or across the country or another country. It's still quite isolating and empty social calories, if you ask me. But I'm not aware of anything linking it specifically with violent behaviors in terms of.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm actually closer to your position than not, but I'm willing to reevaluate it. And, I don't do this research myself, but I look at it, try to stay informed, and try to give people the best advice.
I like how you put it in terms of nutrition. I think that's really fascinating and an easy way for us to understand it, and hopefully for younger kids to understand it. Dr. Stevens, you're always so fantastic to talk to you. I just want to make a note that we didn't go over signs and symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, but we'll link to that in the show notes. Sure. We definitely want to have you back with us. I'll also add homicide rates have gone down historically, but 2020 will be a record number year for Houston and for other major cities across America. We're seeing numbers for 2020 that are beyond the past 15 or 20 years.
Mental health as well. I agree with you. It's going to be off the charts, not in a good way.
Off the charts, not in a good way. We are excited to have you on, and we will look forward to having you back. So parents, send additional questions, thoughts, and comments for Dr. Stevens. Thank you so very much for joining us on the Balanced Voice podcast.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Conversation. You can find real solutions and tangible resources in our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. To join the conversation, follow us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast and on Twitter at @BalancedVoice_. Stay up to date on Runya's work by following her at The Runya Report, and we can't wait to see you next week for another Balanced Conversation.